Please welcome Jamie Bartlett. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Michael, and all of you for being here. We were asked about whether we were optimistic or pessimistic, and you could probably guess from the title of my books that I'm a bit of a pessimist about all of this. And one of the ways I'm a pessimist, I think, is because I believe that a gulf is opening up between the digital technologies that run our lives and the analog systems that we've built over many generations that are there to try to control them. And my fear is, if that gulf becomes too great, if it becomes too wide, then people will start turning against the very idea that technology and progress are somehow synonymous. They'll turn against the idea that democracy is a system that can effectively make technology work in people's interests. And there's almost no knowing quite how far that could go. That's my fear. It's not inevitable. But I'm going to give you a couple of stories from the darknet and elsewhere to illustrate my point. How many of you have been on the dark? Don't fill in your app things, but how many of you have actually been on the darknet? Wow, dude, you're really out there on your own. So I'm not going to ask you any further questions. But for those of you who don't know, you've probably heard of it roughly, but the darknet really came about in, well, quite a few years ago now. US naval intelligence researchers were trying to come up with a way of allowing people to browse the internet without giving away their IP address. Lots of good reasons why you'd want to do that, especially if you're working for US naval intelligence. And they came up with this idea of a web browser that would encrypt your web traffic, route it around the world via 3 different nodes usually, meaning that whatever website you ended up on, the person who owned that website would not know the originator IP address. So they wouldn't know where you'd come from. And this became known as the Tor browser. They've actually just issued an update. It's a bit slicker now, I suppose, maybe using that purple trust color that we heard about. But the idea was that you could suddenly go onto the normal internet without giving away your IP address. And something like between 4 and 5 million people do that now every single day. The Tor project behind this won several awards for the spread of freedom and democracy in the world, and lots of people have very good reason to use this. Most people use it on the normal internet, but it is also your way into the darknet. So the darknet uses the same software to hide something like between, no one knows for sure, maybe 5 and 20,000 websites that use the same protocol to hide the server of a website. So you can visit a website on the Tor network using an anonymous web browser, and the sites can't easily be shut down or located. That's the darknet. URLs are a meaningless string of numbers and letters that finish .onion. You can't get there with a normal web browser. And naturally enough, it's become quite a sort of comfortable place for people who have something to hide. And it doesn't need to be something illegal. So lots of journalists use the darknet. This is secure drop. A lot of newspapers, many of the biggest US newspapers, use this to help people share stories securely with their journalists. There's a lot of there's a sort of whistleblowing on there, and the WikiLeaks caches are available there. You have an awful lot of piracy sites, infamous drugs markets, which we'll come to in a moment, increasingly commercially available hacking services. So if you imagine that a decade ago, to be a computer hacker, you needed to ideally wear a hoodie and sit in a basement, but especially you needed to have some knowledge of network security or programming languages. Of course, that's not the case anymore. Anybody can just go and hire something for you. Rather a lot of extremist and terrorist material is available there because all of this stuff is very hard to shut down. The same, unfortunately, is true of illegal pornography, but also commercially available. Sort of popular sites are on the darknet as well. This is Facebook's darknet site, and I don't think you can quite make out the URL, but it finishes .onion, weirdly it says Facebook core www.onion. Now I said that the web addresses of the darknet are a meaningless string of numbers and letters. They are. They're automatically generated when you create a darknet site. Unless, of course, you're Facebook, in which case you can just generate millions of them because you have so much computing power that you can keep doing it until one of them randomly says Facebook in the title, so you can actually remember it. It's like the modern equivalent of 1 million monkeys at 1 million typewriters writing the complete works of Shakespeare. There you go. Now, this is the most infamous of all the darknet sites, the Silk Road. I'm not going to ask if anybody's ever been on this site before. Weirdly enough, the story that you can buy stuff like cannabis on a darknet site doesn't work quite as well in the Netherlands as it does in the UK. But I'm going to tell it anyway. So the most infamous of all of these sites, and probably the reason that most people have been going on to these sites, sorry sir for calling you out there, is to visit these online darknet markets, they're called. Now, when I first heard about these places, that there are sites on the darknet where illegal stuff is bought and sold, especially drugs, I sort of imagined it would be a set of forums where you would maybe go and converse with a drug dealer and then discuss where you're going to meet offline to transact fully. Well, I mean, you can see quite clearly, you know already how this site actually works because you've seen versions of this for the last several years. It's essentially like Amazon or eBay, except the things that are bought and sold are generally, but not always, illegal. So, what you would do, I'm going to give you a step-by-step guide here about how people buy drugs on the darknet, is people go on there with a pseudonym, they create an account on one of these sites like this, they transfer some cryptocurrency, usually Bitcoin, into their wallet, into their account that's hosted on the site. They then browse through the hundreds, thousands of different products and offers that you can see there. They then place an order, they put in a postal address, and they wait for the product to arrive in the post. And the products nearly always do arrive in the post. Why? Because just like Amazon or eBay, every time somebody uses one of these sites, they go back on there afterwards and give a user review, a score out of 5 for how good the product was, and some written feedback for the seller. Everything is designed around trying to create some mechanism of trust in a world otherwise characterized without trust. So you have, of course, the price. This is an old screen grab for anyone that follows the price of cryptocurrencies. You have a little basket there. You have a little button here that says report this item. So, I mean, obviously not to the police or anything like that, but to the site administrator, if you think that the vendor is not accurately describing his or her product. Now, what this has done, predictably enough, has created an incredible explosion of, firstly, creativity, because they're operating in this strange criminal underworld, but also market competition and choice. I mean, the drugs market's always been characterized by monopolies and cartels. Suddenly, you introduce competition and choice into the drugs market. And so what happens, what any other economist would predict, of course, is that the price starts going down and the product quality starts going up, which is exactly what happened here. The average purity of cocaine bought on the streets in the UK is about 30%, and it's sometimes as low as 2%. For the same price on the darknet, the average purity of cocaine is about 90%. About 70%, and sometimes as high as 90% for the very same price. And I'm not trying to advertise these. I'm not a representative of the Silk Road before you think that. But it's important to understand that that is why these sites have become so popular. That is why something like 1/3 of all drugs users in the UK now say that they have taken drugs from these places. Convenience, choice, excellent customer service. You will never find more friendly, helpful drug dealers than, well, maybe in the Netherlands you will, but generally than on these marketplaces. I used to have interactions with them, and I'd say, oh, hello, yes, I'm sort of undercover, really. Hello, I am looking to buy 1 gram of marijuana. Could you please advise which one would you recommend? And they would say, oh, dear sir, thank you very much for your inquiry. Why don't you try this excellent Afghan Kush? If you're not happy, come back to me straight away. Best wishes, your local drug dealer. This is the key to understanding how these places generated some interesting form of trust, because it all became about pseudonyms. People would create, the vendors and the buyers would create names and identities that were associated with their products, but weren't really them, of course, but they spent a lot of time building up that digital reputation that other people would then start to trust. Now, sparking off this amazing wave of creativity, because you're operating in a world where no one quite trusts anyone and anybody could be an undercover FBI agent, also meant that they had to get very creative. So first of all, they started giving you buy one, get one free offers and your money back, and they introduced a mystery shopper who would go around buying, getting free stuff and then reviewing them. One vendor started offering organic fair trade cocaine, which was really popular, and they would say, well, our drugs aren't being sourced from Colombian warlords, they're coming from local Guatemalan farmers. And we will reintroduce 20% of all profits back into local education programs in Guatemala if you use our products. But they got very clever as well about using things like cryptocurrencies, the idea that these were trustless systems. You don't want to put your credit card details into this site and see what happens, although some people have tried. So, of course, these were really the first adopters of cryptocurrencies, way before anybody else. I mean, when I was writing about this in 2013, 2012, researching it, and Bitcoin was only $10, and I didn't buy any, which is why I'm here. They were the only places that were trying to innovate with using trustless currency, a digital cash like Bitcoin, because they were trying to overcome the problem of how can we have a trusted way of payment when you don't trust the person that's running this site. So they adopted cryptocurrencies. Brilliant. They then had a problem, of course. There's a ledger of every single transaction that's made on the Bitcoin blockchain, and maybe that could come back to us. Maybe we could maybe the police could trace who we are. So they built a micro-laundry system, whereby lots of different people would send their Bitcoin into one website, that website would jumble them all up and then send them on to the final destination, but they'd be different Bitcoin. So it was like a very quick and easy micro-laundry for cryptocurrencies. And of course, then they had a problem, which was that drug dealers were running off with people's money without sending the drugs. And you couldn't call anybody to complain about this, although some people literally did phone the police to say that their drugs hadn't turned up from the Silk Road, because it looked so believable. So they introduced multi-signature escrow payment systems, whereby a buyer and a vendor and a site administrator would all have a wallet, and if 2 of the 3 people involved in the transaction signed off on that, then the money would go from the buyer to the seller, but the seller could always see that the money was being held in an escrow wallet to make sure they were confident in selling the products. So this amazing place, in a way, that I think we could actually learn something from in terms of trust was a weird darknet underground site. Now, it was shut down by the FBI in 2013, but not before in excess of $1 billion worth of sales went through it, making the site administrator $10,000 a day in commission. But they just spiraled up. They spiraled out. All sorts of different versions of these now exist. The Silk Road is gone, but there's dozens of other ones that work exactly the same way. And increasingly, the easiest thing for them to buy and sell is not really drugs, it's stolen information. It's personal data. It's CVV numbers. its credit card details. This is a rough sketch of how much it costs on the different darknet sites currently to buy different types of personal information. And these are coming especially from this site. This is the most popular site at the moment on the darknet. It's called Dream Market. And this is where you will find all sorts of digital information available about people. Every time you see a famous hack or a website's had information stolen or whatever, it nearly always turns up on this or one of the many other places that work in the same way, including, of course, easy to use, commercially available malware, ransomware, other tools for hacking. This kind of lowers the barriers of entry into cybercrime. This is, I think, the main purpose that the darknet currently has. And there's all sorts of different things, these dodgy payment systems, cardable sites, and dodgy PayPal accounts, and social security numbers, and especially CVV numbers and credit card combinations. This is the reason I think this is a big problem, is that it's interesting in how they've created a system of trust here, but at the same time, I fear that it will slowly diminish trust that people have in law enforcement to be able to get on top of all of this stuff. This is what now really worries me. You know that the majority of crime in the UK at least now takes place online, but less than 0.25% of those crimes result not even in a conviction, in a prosecution. Because the nature of digital crime, the nature of crime has changed absolutely. Our police force hasn't. We still complain all the time about back office police officers, like they don't do anything. And the only good police officers are the ones on the street. That's ridiculous. That's not the nature of crime anymore. And so my fear is, and this is the kind of illustration, that crime has changed, it's gone online, but the institutions we've built to tackle crime, they haven't really gone online in the same way at all. And slowly but gradually, our trust will erode in those systems that we've built. Right. So my second story that illustrates the same point is thanks to this fine gentleman here, Alexander Nix, CEO of Cambridge Analytica. Now, you're all roughly familiar with the Cambridge Analytica story, I guess, but I think it has been told completely wrong. And I know this because I've interviewed him, I've interviewed the Trump team that were working with him, and we helped to break the story for the BBC sometime before the story became very popular 6 months ago. I'm not bitter about that, it's fine. The way the story has been told, roughly speaking, is this. Some magical psychological warfare tool was used in a US election to profile millions of people and then target them with Facebook adverts which somehow changed their minds. Millions of people that would have voted for Hillary Clinton suddenly were persuaded by some Facebook ads to vote for Donald Trump. I mean, does that sound plausible to anybody here? I mean, because anyone that works in digital advertising would say, if only we could do that, it'd be brilliant. It's not that simple. What they did, what Cambridge Analytica did, was actually pretty standard stuff. They built using commercially available data, they built profiles on 250 million Americans, buying data sets from the big data brokers and collecting some of their own, credit card ratings, debt levels, mortgage, car ownership, magazine subscription, web browsing history, put them together with the Republican Party's data sets, just figured out the 11 million or so people that they thought in the US would possibly be persuaded to vote Trump that hadn't voted Republican for a while. Worked out what things they thought and cared about, and then relentlessly bombarded those people with content. But what they did importantly was to say, we think, based on our data sets, we think we can win the states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So they chucked a load of money into those states, $85 million on Facebook ads, and they won each of those 3 states by less than 1 percentage point. I think they won Wisconsin by about 11,000 votes. So to me, really what they were doing was something that pretty much every political party is doing, targeting people with ads that relate to them, but they just did it slightly better than the other guys. This worries me because this is changing how elections work. And part of the problem here is not just what they're doing, but it's can the regulators that we have that allow people to feel trust in elections keep up with any of this stuff? That, to me, is the story. Because think about where we're heading with not just Cambridge Analytica now, but targeted adverts when we all have smart devices in our home, when we're creating infinitely more data than we are now, and when your diet and your mood will be correlated and then cross-referenced against 1,000 other things, including your coffee consumption and your baby monitor and your smart car and your smart fridge data, and you, each of you, will receive an advert that is personalized, not to the group, but to every single person, who will each receive a different message from every other person. That is the direction of travel for this sort of thing. How do we as a society hold politicians to account if a politician makes 1 million different promises to 1 million different people and nobody else gets to see what they are? You know, during the Brexit vote in the UK, the Leave campaign were targeting adverts at people saying that the European Union were trying to stop British people from drinking cups of tea. And you wonder that it was 52-48. I mean, probably surprised it wasn't more than that. But this is the question that we should be asking. In 10 years, when we carry on down this path, and when adverts are personalized to unique individuals based on far more data than we have now, can our systems of regulation actually work so people, ordinary voters and citizens, have trust that the election is being run fairly? And that, I think, is the challenge. And that, I think, is why recent votes have been so disputed, because people don't trust in the process anymore. This is partly a failure of regulation as much as anything else. And the final thing, and the same theme, about a year ago, when I was reporting on this for the BBC, did 150 miles in a driverless truck in Florida. So I went 150 miles in this truck. Roads in Florida are completely straight, so it wasn't that impressive. But in another way, it was pretty impressive because, you know, we made a delivery and it was great and it was really exciting, and the jobs that these automated vehicles were creating, these tech companies from Silicon Valley were creating, were really, really good. And I'd always ask the people behind the technology, what is a 50-year-old man who's been a truck driver his entire life, who left school at 18, for whom trucking is a pretty good job actually compared to other stuff that's out there? What is that person supposed to do when the trucking industry is disrupted? And congratulations on all of your excellent work, guys, but what's that person going to do? And they'd always say the same thing to me, which is, they should probably retrain as a machine learning specialist or a robotics engineer. And I think, yeah, maybe they'll do that. What worries me is that they won't do that. They won't do that at all. I just want to show you a couple of quick quotes from something I read recently. I think you can probably read it. I'll just read out the top one rather than all of it. Machines will take care of more and more of the simpler tasks, so there'll be an increasing surplus of human workers at the lower levels of ability. And I'll just mention a couple of things here. A fear this person has about propaganda and other psychological techniques for invasion of privacy and surveillance through computing. This was written by this guy in 1995, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Reads like a Guardian or a New York Times editorial, doesn't it? But it was written by this guy in 1995 when really nobody had computers at all. So it sounded obviously like the ramblings of a madman. Ted Kaczynski, of course, is the last of the sort of neo-Luddites. He killed 3 people, injured many more with a series of letter bomb attacks. What worries me is that not that we'll see the return of the Ted Kaczynskis of this world, but that we'll start slowly to see a ever more sort of angry and frustrated sense about where technology is going. And at the very extreme ends of this, We may even see people like Ted Kaczynski. What I think we will do, rather than seeing truck drivers that are going to retrain as robotics engineers and machine learning specialists, I think we'll see them doing this. I mean, this is a driverless car that is essentially immobilized because someone's drawn a stop sign with a spray paint all the way around it. Now, what will happen is if these machines start hitting the streets, do we really think that truckers will stand by and say, well, it's okay because my great-great-grandchildren will be safer on the roads than I am because of how many people have died in road accidents? No, they won't do that. Of course they won't. What they'll do, if they don't believe that there are routes for them to benefit from this revolution, is that they will be out there with spray paints and dodgy bits of engineering advice that they've bought on the darknet about how you can effectively immobilize these systems. I mean, I know there's quite a few French people in the room. So, I mean, does anyone think that Parisian taxi drivers will be happy with driverless vehicles just turning up? And they'll just say, well, it's okay, this is the great march of progress, it's fine. I think not. So this, to me, is the great danger. This is what worries me as a kind of worst-case scenario, which to me means we need to do a couple of things. We need to thank me when I'm finished. But before we get there, we need obviously to make sure that people continue to believe, or they do believe and feel, that technology is a route for liberation. It's a route for personal well-being, and not some form of oppression that's just making a few people at the top get very rich and not helping me in my life. And this is not really a prediction I'm making. I mean, I think everyone can feel over the last year or so that technology's taken a big kicking. And maybe that's a good thing. It's a necessary correction. But now, of course, the task is to understand why and to work out what we do to ensure that it doesn't get so bad that we have Ted Kaczynskis out on the street. One of them, I think, in the case of the dark net, for example, is there are things that we can learn about how they work there in that fascinating, innovative criminal underworld to make ourselves safer. But partly it's going to be the police themselves are going to have to radically change the way they think about policing the internet. When it comes to something like Cambridge Analytica, ironically, given this is the story that seems to have galvanized so much of the recent concern, I think this is one of the easier things that we can deal with. We need to make sure our election rules are up to speed with the digital reality. We used to have, we have regulations that means that spending levels have to be checked, that adverts have to be published, that a watchdog gets to check whether it's true or not. Well, we need to make sure that every political party, because this is every political party in every democracy in the world now doing this, has to publish every single advert that they produce, who they're targeting, and what data they're using. Now, it's going to be a bit of a pain in the arse for some of them to do that, but this is a case of us bringing up to speed the regulations that we have so people believe that the system still works. For all the times that blockchain may or may not be overhyped, I think when it comes to transparency in the ad tech market, blockchain is actually going to be, that's the one place I can obviously see that it's going to be a real game changer. And finally, in regard to these smart machines or whatever else, we need to make sure that people who might lose in the great transition we're going through believe and know and do indeed have ways to benefit and gain and win from this change rather than simply lose. Because if we don't, we've been through reformations and revolutions before, but we've never had one with universal suffrage. And if we don't make sure that people feel like they're benefiting, people are going to turn against technology, and then all the wonderful benefits that you've heard about and will continue to hear about, they will be lost, and that would be a shame. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks very much, Mikhail.
So Jamie, you will join us later for the discussion at the end of the day. But so if I understand you, so we have this huge problem where the institutions that manage trust don't work anymore. The government is not protecting us. And the solution is that we need honest politicians that keep their promises. So we're doomed. We should go live like Kaczynski in a cabin up in the mountains of Montana. But you're an optimist, right?
No, what gave you that idea? Okay. No, I'm not an optimist at all. I'm extremely pessimistic. But yeah, I suppose the way that I'm thinking about it at the moment, to sort of turn all these different stories that we've heard recently, at Cambridge Analytica, which, like I said, is completely misreported in my view, and Russian interference and hacking and bots and trolling, and a lot of them in my mind are a sort of they're almost like tremors of two tectonic plates that are rubbing up against each other. So digital technology, analog norms, analog expectations, analog institutions, you heard about education already, and they're just not working very well together. And I find that a more useful way of explaining this than simply saying, oh, there's some really bad guys in Silicon Valley and they're doing all this bad stuff. And oh, there's these horrible people in Russia and they're doing all that terrible stuff. Because I think when you look at it that way, you're missing what's really going on here, the sort of great turbulence of a real change in how we communicate and produce things.
How are you optimistic about how the young generations will deal with this, will solve this?
In one sense, it's often said they've been brought up with this, and so they'll know what to do. But that also implies they don't know anything apart from this. So they won't necessarily know what they're missing or what other options there are open to them. So I'm optimistic, actually. When I speak to young people, there's a sort of growing sense of skepticism, of nervousness, of being actually quite careful with their data, which I think is really, really important to cultivate. I am optimistic about the inevitability of us developing new technologies, solutions, new norms. The problem is that norms take a while to develop, and it feels like we're in a bit of a race. But so when you saw that list of interesting new technologies, Steemit and Mastodon and all these other things, I'm quite excited about all of them. But I am also cognizant that they will create problems of their own. So the idea that blockchain is the answer to all these and there won't be any other problems, obviously not the case. Because also on the darknet, they are innovating with blockchain-based marketplaces that are completely impossible to close down. So on the one hand, it solves one problem, potentially about data sovereignty, but it's going to create another problem for digital policing. So I think we've always got to be mindful as well that while I'm optimistic about some of the things we're trying and experimenting and we will respond, those responses will themselves also cause other problems in the system.
So what do you expect from the regulators? Do you expect that the regulations will come in and that
it's already happening. Like the fact is that even in the last 6 months or a year, I think you've seen politicians have a much stiffer backbone about this, partly reflecting public concern over all of these issues, which is why I think it's quite a good thing. And a very interesting story that I did a radio show recently about regulation of big tech. And I spoke to Ralph Nader, who was the driving force, sorry for the pun, behind car safety in the 1960s in the US.
Unsafe at any speed.
Unsafe at any speed, which he published in 1965, and then in 1966, the first mandatory seatbelts and shatterproof windscreens were introduced into the automotive industry. And at the time, the industry said, we're going to lose to Japanese competitors, it's impossible, the industry will collapse. 2 years later, after the regulations are passed, you find Ford and General Motors competing with each other over who has the best seatbelts and the safest shatterproof windscreens. So if the regulators can get tougher on certain things, particularly on privacy, you'll find that the companies will start competing over what will become a new consumer expectation.
So who's the present-day Ralph Nader?
Or me, or maybe Andrew Keane, I don't know. I mean, who's about what? I asked Ralph Nader that, and he said, well, Ralph Nader still, because I'm writing about technology now. So, but I'm not sure about that.
He wants to be the Ralph Nader of today.
But maybe in keeping with the time, it's not a single individual anymore. It's not a single person with one big book that everyone can coalesce around. That was easier in the 1960s. It's so noisy now to have that same kind of cut through. The new Ralph Naders, I think, are lots of different people, individual consumers, technologists building new platforms, European Union regulations who are actually standing up on this stuff. The domestic information commissioners that are trying to enforce things like GDPR.
What
There's
about the
lots
people
of,
in the room?
like I said, and technologists who independently are actually trying to develop alternative services and platforms. So there isn't one Ralph, I'm not going to say we're all Ralph Naders, but it's definitely a bit more of a distributed challenge now.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.